In a neighborhood engineered for perfection, my home stood out like a relic that refused to kneel to time. Willow Ridge was a masterclass in uniformity: white vinyl fences, trimmed hedges, identical pastel facades. It looked more like a model village than a real place, which was exactly how the HOA liked it. But my cottage on the corner of Maple and Crestview told a different story. Wrapped in a dark chestnut fence, weathered but noble, it belonged to another era entirely. That fence wasn't just mine, it was my family's. Hand-built by my great-grandfather in 1911 from salvaged shipyard wood, reinforced with iron brackets he'd forged himself, it had survived 2 world wars, 5 hurricanes, and decades of indifference. When I inherited the house last year, I made restoring it my mission. I spent weeks sanding it down, replacing warped slats, and restaining it to its original hue. The grain felt alive under my hands. It creaked in the wind like it had stories to tell. I never expected it to become a battlefield. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, printed on HOA letterhead and tucked smugly into my mailbox. Violation: non-compliant fencing. All perimeter fencing must conform to HOA standard. White vinyl, no higher than 48 inches. Please remove or replace within 14 days. At first, I laughed. Surely this was a mistake. The fence had been standing since before Willow Ridge was even developed. It was on the historical registry, preserved by county ordinance, and had been documented in the local historical society's archives. This wasn't a zoning issue. It was a landmark. I brought the documentation to the HOA office the next morning, confident it would all be resolved with a signature and a nod. That's when I met Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. Karen was precision incarnate: steel gray bob, pressed slacks, and a perpetual squint like everything around her offended her sense of order. She barely looked up from her clipboard as I handed her the folder. "I'm here about the violation notice," I said. "There's been a misunderstanding." She skimmed the top sheet, unimpressed. "Your fence violates HOA Code 4.2.1 on fencing uniformity." "That's not a misunderstanding. It's a correction. It's a historically protected structure, registered with the county, documented by the state." She glanced at one page, then closed the folder. The HOA was not consulted. Historical or not, it disrupts visual harmony. I blinked. "You can't override state law." Karen smiled, thin and unbothered. "This is private property governed by HOA bylaws. We enforce what's best for the community." It was clear then, this wasn't about the fence. It was about control. Karen wasn't interested in facts. She was building an empire, one compliance notice at a time. I filed an appeal, attached every document I could find, even a letter from the County Historical Commission. While I waited, I started hearing things. Neighbors told me about bird baths removed without warning, porch swings deemed unsafe, even a family forced to repaint their home because the color wasn't on the approved palette. One man called her a dictator in khakis. No one had fought her and won. But I wasn't backing down. 2 weeks passed. Then came the second letter. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was taped to my front door. A compliance order, dated and signed by Karen Whitmore, authorizing immediate corrective action for ongoing violation. I raced around back, heart pounding. They had already begun. My fence gone. Torn down. Splintered planks littered the yard like fallen soldiers. The iron brackets were bent, rusted, discarded like trash. A backhoe idled in the driveway. The contractor handed me a receipt and a shrug. She said it was an emergency removal. Said it was authorized. I stood there, speechless, staring at the wreckage. Generations of history, erased by one woman's pen stroke. Karen had declared war. But she had made one critical mistake. She didn't know what she'd just destroyed. And she had no idea who she was dealing with. The demolition didn't just shatter wood. It shattered the illusion that I could resolve this civilly. I spent the evening photographing the wreckage. Every splintered beam. Every rusted nail. Every scar left on the soil where the fence had stood for over a century. I backed up the photos, annotated each one, and made copies of every relevant document. Karen had turned this into a legal matter, and I intended to meet her in the one arena where she had no clipboard to hide behind, court. The next morning, I called Marcia Cleary, a preservation attorney recommended by the Historical Society. Her voice was crisp, confident, and laced with disbelief when I explained what had happened. "She demolished a protected landmark?" she repeated. "That's not just a civil issue. That's a violation of state preservation law." Within 48 hours, we had filed a formal cease and desist against the HOA and launched a civil suit against Karen Whitmore personally. Not the board, not the HOA. Her. For willful destruction of a state-recognized structure. But I knew legal proceedings would move slowly. And in the meantime, Karen still held the microphone at every HOA meeting, still operated as if no one could touch her. I couldn't let her control the narrative. So I went public. I started with a sign, simple, sturdy, and planted directly where the fence once stood. "This historic fence was illegally demolished by your HOA president." I used her name. Bold, black paint. Let them read it from their car windows. Then I turned to the internet. The video took less than a day to edit. Side-by-side photos of the original fence and the aftermath. A voiceover detailing the history of the structure, the legal documentation Karen ignored, and the footage of the contractor admitting it was an emergency removal. By the end of the week, the video had over 100,000 views. Comments flooded in, stories from people across the country dealing with power-hungry HOAs, words of support, offers to help rebuild. Even local journalists reached out for interviews. Inside Willow Ridge, the effect was seismic. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped me on the sidewalk. They shared their stories, minor violations that turned into fines, letters worded like threats, unspoken fear of speaking out. Karen hadn't just overstepped with me. She'd been stomping for years. The morning after the video broke, a yellow envelope appeared in my mailbox. No stamp, no name. Inside was a stack of photocopied HOA emails, internal memos, meeting transcripts. One line stood out in bold. "We need to remove the fence before the appeal is heard. Delay invites scrutiny." Karen hadn't just acted rashly. She had acted deliberately. The final confirmation came from the county office. They responded to our complaint with startling speed. Karen had received notification of the fence's protected status not once, but twice. First when it was registered 5 years ago, and again just 3 months before the demolition. Both notices bore her signature of acknowledgement. I forwarded everything to Marcia. She called within the hour. "She's not just negligent. She's criminally liable." The next HOA meeting was packed, standing room only. Karen looked different, rattled. Her usual smug composure had cracked, replaced with a defensive stiffness. She tried to call the meeting to order, but people kept interrupting, polite at first, then louder. "What gives you the right? Who else are you targeting?" I stood when the room went silent. I filed a lawsuit, not just for damages, for destruction of history. And I have the documentation to prove intent. Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I placed a printed photo on the table before the board. It showed the original fence, my great-grandfather standing beside it, hammer in hand. "This isn't about a fence," I said. "It's about someone who thinks power is a license to erase what doesn't fit her vision." But some of us remember what came before her rules. And we're not backing down. Karen didn't respond. She didn't have to. The board adjourned the meeting in silence. The seeds were planted, and Karen had no idea how quickly they'd grow. The morning after the HOA meeting, I woke to a cold realization. Karen wasn't going to back down, no matter how much evidence we piled against her. She built her empire on the backs of rules and restrictions, and she wasn't about to let one outsider knock it over. I knew I had to hit her where it hurt. The legal system. But there was more at stake now than just a fence. This had become a battle of wills, a fight for the right to exist without fear of oppression, of petty tyrants who thought their word was law. Marcia and I worked quickly. We drafted a civil lawsuit seeking not only restitution for damages to the fence but also punitive damages for the deliberate destruction of a historically significant landmark. The documents were filed with the county, and within days, a hearing was scheduled. I spent hours preparing. I combed through every archived newspaper article about Willow Ridge's history, collected statements from neighbors, and compiled my own narrative, my great-grandfather's legacy tied to the very wood Karen had torn down. It wasn't just my heritage at stake, it was the collective memory of the neighborhood. But even with all the legal fortifications, there was a shadow hanging over me. Karen. I knew she would fight with everything she had. And from what I'd seen, she wasn't above playing dirty. The day of the hearing arrived. The courthouse was quiet, the air thick with tension. I stood in the lobby, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I wasn't just going after Karen. I was going after everything she represented. The unchecked power of HOA boards and the erosion of community spirit for the sake of conformity. Inside the courtroom, Karen sat on the opposite side. She wasn't alone. A corporate attorney in a sharp suit sat beside her, flipping through legal briefs with a practiced air. But Karen didn't have her usual smirk. She looked unsettled, tapping her pen against the table, eyes darting from side to side. When the judge called the case, I took a deep breath and stood. Karen's attorney was the first to speak, spinning the narrative that the HOA had acted in good faith and that I had misunderstood the zoning restrictions. He claimed that the fence's demolition had been necessary to maintain neighborhood aesthetics and safety. I wanted to laugh, but I held my ground. Marcia had already set the tone by presenting the official historical records, showing that the fence had been registered as a protected landmark and that Karen, as HOA president, had received official notice of this status twice. You can't claim ignorance when the facts are right in front of you, Marcia argued. The courtroom fell silent as Karen's attorney sputtered, unable to respond. That's when I took the stand. I spoke not just about the fence, but about Karen Whitmore, how she'd used her position to oppress the neighbors, to control their choices, and to erase history for the sake of conformity. I told the court about my great-grandfather and the pride he'd taken in building that fence, about how it had stood for generations, weathering storms, families, and even decades of HOA rule. You destroyed more than wood, I said, looking directly at Karen. You destroyed a part of our history, a living testament to a time before Willow Ridge became a soulless subdivision. Karen's gaze hardened, but I saw a flicker of something, uncertainty. For the first time, she looked like the world might be closing in on her. The county preservation officer was called to testify. Her testimony was short but damning. She confirmed that the fence had been registered as a historical structure and that Karen had been personally notified on multiple occasions. She didn't mince words. Karen had knowingly violated the law, disregarded historical preservation regulations, and caused irreversible damage to the property. The evidence was undeniable. As the judge deliberated, I sat back, a quiet sense of satisfaction spreading through me. Karen's arrogance had undone her. The gavel came down with a decisive thud.
Guilty.
Karen Whitmore was personally liable for the destruction of the fence. The HOA was fined $20,000 for its negligence. And, in a move I hadn't expected, the court ordered Karen to pay $84,223 in damages, including emotional distress, historical restoration, and punitive damages for the reckless destruction of a landmark. The judge's words rang in my ears. Your actions have not only harmed an individual, but have also disrespected the collective memory of this community. There will be consequences for that. I stood up, still trying to process the verdict. It wasn't just a win for me. It was a victory for every person who had ever been silenced, for every homeowner who had felt powerless beneath the weight of HOA rules. But there was one more thing that made the victory sweeter: Karen's face. It wasn't the smug, unflinching expression I'd seen all these months. It was the look of someone who realized that, no matter how hard she tried to maintain control, she was just a person. And I wasn't afraid of her. The aftermath of the ruling didn't play out as I expected. Karen tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear the weight of her actions was bearing down on her. The press coverage was relentless. The local news ran a story about the court's decision, and social media buzzed with outrage, most of it directed squarely at Karen and her relentless grip on the HOA. The videos from my own channel hit record views, and local residents started coming forward, sharing their own experiences with her reign of control. By the time the full impact of the verdict hit, Karen was a shadow of her former self. The HOA board, once so enamored with her leadership, began to distance themselves from her. Mr. Alvarez, the quiet retired teacher who had never been a fan of Karen's iron-fisted rule, took the lead in calling for her resignation. It wasn't long before the board officially voted to remove her from office, citing failure to uphold community standards. Karen sent a letter to the neighborhood, though, claiming she was the victim of mob mentality and that justice had been subverted. I didn't bother reading the rest of her rant. Instead, I focused on rebuilding. The fence restoration project had already begun, with workers carefully recreating the original design using reclaimed materials. It was an odd feeling, watching the new planks go up, knowing that each piece was as much a symbol of victory as a piece of wood. The Historical Society oversaw the project, and they did more than just restore the fence. They added a small plaque at the base of the oak tree, where the fence began. This fence stands as a testament to the preservation of history and the resilience of community. I stood there, watching the final touches, my heart swelling. The fence had been more than just a physical structure. It had been a rallying point, a symbol of everything that had been taken and, through sheer will, returned. But I knew that the battle wasn't truly over. Not until Karen had to face the full scope of what she had done. The final chapter came a month later. The community meeting, the first since Karen's removal, was tense but hopeful. Mr. Alvarez presided over the gathering, and for the first time in years, the room felt like a place of collaboration, not fear. People spoke freely. Ideas were shared. No one was afraid to ask questions. When the topic turned to the future of the HOA, Mr. Alvarez addressed the room. "We've been through a lot," he began, his voice steady, "but I think we've learned something important. The true strength of a neighborhood comes not from rules, but from respect and understanding." I couldn't help but smile. It was everything I'd hoped for. The old guard was gone. The future was open. After the meeting, I stayed behind, helping to clean up. Evelyn, the elderly woman who had given me the photo of my great-grandfather and the fence, approached me with a smile. Her eyes were full of warmth, her hands clasped gently in front of her. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said softly. "Karen's been a tyrant for years. It's nice to see the power shift to people who actually care." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been too afraid to stand up. A victory for those whose voices had been silenced, whose homes had been held hostage by petty rules and arbitrary power. As I turned to leave, I noticed a small group gathered by the fence. They were standing in front of the plaque, reading it, touching the wood, quietly admiring the restoration. I joined them, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. The oak tree, still standing proud, had witnessed it all. And so had the fence. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a reminder that even in a world where rules often felt like chains, people had the power to break free. Karen had tried to erase history, but instead, she had made it. I glanced at the house behind me, the one that had started it all. The house that had stood witness to generations of lives, each one leaving its own mark. I had my grandfather's strength in my blood. And now, that same strength ran through the entire community. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the oak tree, I realized that this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. The future of Willow Ridge was ours to shape.